The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult with your financial advisor. For many, estate planning is a family affair. Choosing powers of attorney, beneficiaries, and executors typically involves multiple conversations and planning with loved ones, but not all families look the same. According to a Pew Research study in 2023, 42% of adults report not having a romantic partner. Meanwhile, a quarter of U.S. 40-year-olds reported never being married, hitting a record high in 2021. So what considerations do you need to make if you're a single adult with no children when it comes to planning your estate? Joining me today is Joe Frossard of Samasco Law. All right, so my first question for you is, for single adults with no kids, it might be easy to dismiss estate planning entirely. Is this a bad idea?
Yeah, it's definitely a bad idea. Even if you really don't have a lot of concern about, what happens after you pass away. A part of estate planning is the power of attorney and patient advocate, and planning for what would happen if you were living but incapacitated. And it can be a really bad situation, especially for single people, because there's no one who has this kind of clear role to take over in those situations. If you're married, even if you don't have a power of attorney or a patient advocate signed, your spouse is, the obvious to take over handling your financial affairs and making your medical decisions. If you're single, there's not really necessarily anyone who has priority over everyone else. And so there can be a big fight about it, a lot of litigation. Some possible outcomes can be if you're in a hospital and they send you to a rehab or something like that, it could be that an institutional guardian is put into place, like a public guardian. You hear a lot of horror stories about that. They make their money off of doing these things, and so they take as much of your money as possible.
Jeez.
And give you oftentimes the worst care that is really available, because you don't have anyone who really cares about you that has that authority to make those decisions. Instead, you have this person who's, just motivated by profit. So as a single person, like I said, even if you have no concern about what happens to your assets when you pass away, you really want to make sure you have power of attorney in place, a patient advocate in place to appoint who would make medical decisions for you if you couldn't make them on your own. And then also the same thing for financial decisions.
For maybe somebody who isn't sure who to put in place for those powers of attorney, who would you recommend? Because if you do have friends or family, it should be someone who has your best interests at heart.
Yeah, definitely. I'd say even more, a lot of the time people are kind of tempted to favor, someone maybe with medical experience for medical decisions and financial experience. And that's a little bit less important. More important would be that they really have your best interest at heart and know you. I mean, you want to have, especially for the financial power of attorney, someone who you do trust, someone with money, but they don't need to be a professional or anything like that. Just someone who wouldn't be stealing from you or anything like that. But you also, really want to make sure you have those alternates in place, because you don't know what will happen to them or if they'll be unable to do it or step down. You really want to have typically at least 3 people where if one can't do it, then the next can do it, and then the next can do it.
Earlier, you were talking about some of those horror stories with people not putting someone in place. Is there any that you can share?
Just really common practice. I mean, if someone's in a nursing home, for example, and there's no one who kind of steps up, then the nursing home will petition for guardianship and conservatorship, and someone will take over. Those public guardians, sometimes have 100 wards, and they just don't have any reason to pay attention if their ward is complaining. It's just a really bad situation to be in, because your ward has been determined by the state to not be competent. So the guardian, if their ward is complaining, can just say they don't know what they're talking about. How
do the estate plans themselves differ between people who are married and those who aren't?
So a typical estate plan for a married couple, the spouse would be the first on everything. Typically, they'd be the one to inherit everything, or everything would be jointly held. If there's a trust, it would be a joint trust with both of them as settlers and trustees. Powers of attorney would be to each other first, usually. So for married couples, there's a little bit less of a concern about estate planning, because as long as they still have their spouse, most of their assets usually will go to their spouse without any controversy. And then, again, kind of like the power of attorney, if they do pass away, typically a lot of their assets, even if there's anything to go through probate, it'll be, obvious who's in charge and who gets most of everything will be their spouse. For a single person, that can be, tricky. It depends on, if they have kids, it might be kind of obvious. If they don't, sometimes it goes to like your heirs at law if there's nothing in place. And that can be sometimes like dozens of people. If they, don't have a spouse, if they don't have kids, and they don't have their parents, it can go to their siblings or their deceased siblings' kids. Or we had one recently where the person had passed away with no spouse or kids. Their mother passed away. So it went to their grandparents had 10 children, 4 of whom had passed away, leaving, and those people had a total of around a dozen kids or so. So it went like 17 ways or so.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, so there were a bunch of people getting like $15. But it just makes it a much more difficult, complicated case. And obviously it wasn't what, I can't imagine that person, that's what they really wanted to happen with their assets when they passed away.
Yeah. How does the wealth transfer process differ if you're a single person? Is it a good idea to maybe like donate to charitable organizations? Obviously depends on what you want as an individual, but I'm just curious what that process looks like if you don't really have someone to leave it to.
So if you don't have anyone to leave it to, most of our clients who have no one that they can really think of to leave it to, will be leaving it to charities. And, that's fairly easy. And you can sometimes contact that charity before you pass. Sometimes those charities will help draft the estate plan or help provide language for it and make sure it's executed when you pass away. Sometimes if you have, no one that you really have to name or anything, it can get difficult to make sure that your wishes are followed because no one's paying attention. And you can, risk that you had an estate plan that said give everything to charity, but what ends up happening is no one ever finds it or anything, and it goes to your heirs at law, like whoever those people might be. And, or some of those people might find your estate plan and say, if we just throw this out, then we get everything and no one's the wiser. So you do kind of want to make sure that someone who has some kind of stake in it will have your estate plan.
I know a big part of planning for retirement or in the estate plan process is figuring out long-term care. What should unmarried adults without kids need to consider when it comes to planning for retirement or planning long-term care? Because I feel like a lot of times either the kids will kind of help take care of the parent until it gets to a point where they can't. So what maybe should they consider when it comes to those things?
For married and unmarried people, a pretty common scenario is that if they're getting long-term care, they're in a nursing home, that they spend down all of their assets and then Medicaid starts paying for. For people with kids, it's more of a concern because oftentimes they had stocked up a considerable amount of money that they entirely intended to leave their kids. Without any kids, sometimes there was some, intention to leave money to somebody or some charity and that was something that they really cared about, but less often. More often they'll be, they didn't necessarily save a ton of money because there was no one really needed it. We see at least people in that situation not try too hard to try to preserve the assets for anything, but sometimes they do. And, just like a married couple or anything, they can do things like have an irrevocable trust or put more of their money into home equity, which is protected from Medicaid as long as you have like a Lady Bird deed or something with the house to make sure it goes to someone after you pass away without probate.
Is there like a golden age for when a single person should start estate planning? Because I feel like if you're probably like in your 30s or maybe even 40s, you might be like, oh, I'm not retiring for another 10, 15, 20 years.
A lot of the time we say, and it's actually really the prudent thing to do, is you have a power of attorney and patient advocate signed as soon as you're 18. And before then, your parents can act legally as your guardian if anything decisions need to be made. But after that, you can't. It's pretty, most people don't do it when they're 18 or anything like that, or even in their early 20s. But, as you are getting into your 30s and 40s, and you don't have a spouse, who's going to take over? Is it going to be your parents? Are they the best people to to make these decisions. And even if they did, they'd have to go through court to do it. And it's a much more of a hassle than if they had the power of attorney signed. I see that especially with some people who are like maybe estranged from their parents, like the people who are, I definitely don't want them to be involved in my life. If that would be like your parents, if they're living, or your siblings, and you don't want one of those people, then getting that power of attorney patient advocate is going to be really important. The other parts, as far as your will, trust, things like that, probably 40s would be a good time when you really start thinking about it. Even if if it's someone who's single and they don't have a lot of intention to leave a ton behind, you might just be kind of realize you're in a situation where you're building up money for your retirement that you plan on spending. But if anything happened to you earlier than retirement, there'll be a lot of assets there, and you want to make sure it doesn't just go to wherever people you might not like. So
right.
So it wouldn't be a bad idea to have something in place.
This is maybe a little bit straying from the estate planning specifically, but I found a 2023 report from the Federal Reserve that said unpartnered adults tend to be financially worse off than partnered adults. And around 64% of single adults say they were doing okay financially compared to 77% of those who were, had a partner.
Right.
Do you agree with that? And if so, what can single adults do to achieve financial stability?
I mean, I think that makes sense. It's almost a little surprisingly how not different those are. With, married couples, you have the two incomes. There's an economy of scale kind of with housing. Usually it's cheaper to get, for two people to live together and both have income than one. You do see more, married couples tending to, have those like goals to save for the kids and save for retirement and stuff like that, and save for an inheritance for the kids. And then single people single can also include divorced, which is expensive, and also widowed and things like that, which is also will end up being kind of expensive. So it does make sense that that's the situation. Yeah. So for those single people, I mean, it's possibly looking into like a roommate situation or something like that can actually be, especially for older adults, can be really good because again, there's just someone to also be there in case anything happens to you. Sharing the cost of housing definitely contributes to the financial stability. And those are kind of the main things you see. People who have that, they own their house. It's a little bit, it's more house than they need on their own, so they have someone else living there. And even if they're just sharing utilities and taxes and things like that, we often tend to see people in that situation end up having more saved than people just trying to do it completely on their own.
That's really good advice. Once I get to the end of the episode, I like to do like an our 2 cents, but really it's your 2 cents. So what would your 2 cents be for someone who's single, doesn't have kids when it comes to estate planning?
Yeah. So like I was saying, the biggest thing is that power of attorney and patient advocate. I think that people who are single with no kids oftentimes think, well, why would I do any estate planning? It's not really a concern of mine. No one really depends on me in that way. So, I don't need it, but the power of attorney and patient advocate, that's for your own sake. You really don't want to be in a situation where the wrong person is in control of you. And at the same time, even the estate plan for what happens with your assets, keep in mind with both those things, there are laws in place that say where everything goes and who's in charge if you don't have anything. And especially if that person or those people are people that you really wouldn't want getting your money, wouldn't want getting any power over you, then you definitely want to have documentation saying that's not what you want.
All right, that does it for this edition of Not Your Father's 2 Cents. Sources used in this episode will be linked in the description. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll meet you back here next week.